Hold out your hand. If you are wearing a ring, or a watch, or even just holding a phone, you are almost certainly touching it right now. A metal so ordinary that it sits in wedding drawers and dentist trays and the corners of forgotten circuit boards. So familiar that you stopped seeing it years ago. Now picture every scrap of it ever pulled from the earth. Every ring on every hand, every coin ever struck, every bar stacked in every vault on the planet, every necklace buried with every pharaoh, every ounce clawed out of the ground across more than 6,000 years of human effort and blood. Melt all of it together into a single solid block. That block would measure only about 22 meters on each side. It would fit, with room to spare, inside 3 ordinary swimming pools. That is all of it, the entire supply. Every empire that rose and drowned on it, every war fought over it, every life spent digging for it in the dark, and the whole of it would not fill more than a few backyard pools. And here is the part that should stop you cold. That metal in your hand is older than the sun. It was not made on this planet. It was not even made inside an ordinary star. It was forged in one of the most violent events the universe has ever produced, billions of years before the Earth existed, long before there was anyone alive to want it. So this is the question worth sitting with, all the way to the end. Why has the human species been willing to enslave, to slaughter, and even to make it a crime to own, over a soft yellow metal that does almost nothing useful at all? The answer runs from the collision of dead stars to the phone in your pocket, and it is far stranger than any of the legends. Start before the beginning. Nearly everything you can hold was cooked inside stars. The carbon in your body, the oxygen you are breathing, the iron in your blood, all of it was fused in the cores of ancient stars and flung across space when those stars died. That is the ordinary way the universe builds heavy things. Stars live, stars burn, stars die, and the ashes become planets and people. Gold is not ordinary. Gold cannot be made that way. To forge a single atom of gold, you need conditions so extreme they almost never occur anywhere in the cosmos. You need a flood of neutrons so dense that atomic nuclei swallow them faster than they can fall apart, a process physicists call rapid neutron capture. And the place that happens is not the warm heart of a living star, it is the corpse of one. When a giant star collapses and dies, it can leave behind a neutron star. This is matter crushed to an almost unimaginable density, so dense that a single teaspoon of it would weigh millions of tons here on Earth. Now picture 2 of these dead stars caught in each other's gravity, circling, spiraling closer across millions of years, until at last they slam together. The collision releases a burst of energy called a kilonova, and in that single instant, neutron-rich matter is blasted out into space, and heavy elements form in a matter of seconds, gold among them. In one heartbeat of cosmic violence, a dead star manufactures more gold than humanity has mined in its entire history. For decades, this was only a theory. Then, in 2017, telescopes around the world caught 2 neutron stars colliding for the first time and confirmed what the physicists had suspected. The gold of the universe is born in the wreckage of stars that have already died. So the gold in a wedding ring did not come from the ground, not originally. It drifted through the darkness for billions of years as a kind of cosmic dust, and it was already unthinkably ancient when our own sun first flickered to life. The leading science says that every gold atom you will ever touch is older than the entire solar system. But that opens a puzzle. If gold came sailing in from the death of distant stars, why is it locked inside mountains and hidden in riverbeds, instead of scattered evenly across the ground for anyone to scoop up? The answer is that most of Earth's gold is not within reach at all, and never will be. When the young Earth was still a churning ball of molten rock, the heavy metals, gold included, sank toward the center of the planet. They drained down through the melt and locked themselves inside Earth's iron core, thousands of kilometers beneath your feet, sealed away forever. The gold that humans actually mine arrived later and by a separate road. According to the leading explanation, it came in a second delivery, a long bombardment of asteroids that hammered the young planet after its core had already hardened and closed. Those impactors carried their own cargo of gold, and because the core was already sealed, that gold had nowhere to sink. It stayed near the surface, stranded in the crust, where billions of years of heat and pressure and flowing water slowly gathered it into the veins and nuggets we chase today. So every gram of gold that has ever passed through human hands followed the same impossible journey, born in a collision of dead stars, adrift in the dark for eons, delivered to a newborn planet by a rain of asteroids, then buried, squeezed, and concentrated across the whole long history of the Earth, waiting for something to come along that wanted it badly enough to dig. That something was us. And the strangest thing of all is this: we wanted it long before we had the faintest use for it. Here is a fact that quietly rewrites the story of civilization. Gold is one of the very few metals that appears in nature already pure. Iron has to be smelted out of stubborn ore at brutal temperatures. Copper and tin have to be dug up and refined and alloyed. But gold can be found simply lying in a stream bed, gleaming, ready to use, needing no fire and no chemistry and no knowledge at all. It does not rust. It does not tarnish. It does not corrode. A piece of gold can sit in water or buried in soil for 10,000 years and be pulled out still shining, exactly as it went in. That is why gold is almost certainly the first metal humans ever worked. Not because it was useful, it was useless. It could not hold an edge like flint or a shape under stress like bronze. Humans picked it up for one reason. It was there, it was beautiful, and unlike everything else in their fragile, rotting, dying world, it never seemed to decay. For the oldest proof, travel to the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria. In 1972, an excavator operator digging a trench for a new factory turned up a handful of strange, glinting objects and carried them home in a shoebox. Days later, he thought better of it and called the local museum. What he had stumbled into became known as the Varna necropolis, and it held something no one was prepared for. More than 3,000 gold objects, buried in ancient graves, dating back over 6,000 years. Sit with that number. This gold is older than the Egyptian pyramids. It is older than the first written words of Sumer. It is the oldest worked gold ever discovered anywhere on Earth, and it was being carefully shaped by people who had no writing, no coins, no cities, and no empires. A culture we barely have a name for was already a master of gold. But the graves at Varna reveal something even deeper than their age. Look closely at who received the gold. A small number of graves are practically drowning in it, a single body adorned with thousands of golden ornaments, while most of the others hold little or nothing. And some of the richest graves of all contain no body at all, only a symbolic burial, an empty outline of a person, packed with treasure meant to travel with a soul. 6,000 years ago, before there were kings, before there were nations, before there was money, gold was already the language of power. It already carved the few away from the many. It already said, without a single written word, this person is worth more than you are. Notice what still has not happened. Nobody is using gold for anything. It builds no tools. It grows no food. It wins no wars and heals no wounds. Its entire value rests on three things. It is rare, it is permanent, and it catches the light like nothing else on Earth. Human beings looked at a metal that could do nothing and decided it was the flesh of the gods and the mark of the mighty. That decision, to treat gold as supremely precious for no practical reason whatsoever, is the seed of everything that follows. Because the moment an entire society agrees that a thing has value, that thing quietly becomes something far more dangerous than any tool. It becomes money. For thousands of years after Varna, gold was wealth, but it was clumsy, suspicious wealth. To pay with it, you had to weigh it on a scale, test its purity, and argue about it, every single time, with every single stranger. Trust had to be built from scratch at every exchange. Gold was valuable, but it was not yet convenient. Then, in a kingdom called Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, someone solved the problem and changed the shape of human life. The Lydians were fortunate. Their rivers ran thick with gold, washed down from the mountains. And by roughly 600 years before the Common Era, they had begun stamping precious metal into small, standardized pieces. The great leap forward came under a king whose name still surfaces, thousands of years later, whenever anyone wants to describe staggering wealth. His name was Croesus. Rich as Croesus, people still say, without knowing they are naming a real man. Croesus is credited with issuing the first true gold coins of guaranteed, standardized purity. His metalworkers learned to separate gold from silver and strike pure coins of each, every single one carrying a fixed weight and a fixed fineness, stamped with the royal emblem of a lion facing a bull. This was not merely a tidier way to carry gold. It was a revolution in trust itself. A stamped coin meant you no longer had to weigh the metal, or test it, or trust the person handing it over. The stamp did the vouching for you. The authority of the king stood behind every piece. A total stranger in a distant marketplace could look at that coin and accept it on sight. For the first time in history, value could pass from hand to hand without the two hands ever having to trust each other. The idea was so powerful, it could not be contained. When the Persian Empire conquered Lydia, the conquerors did not discard the invention. They seized it and began minting gold coins of their own. From Lydia and the Greek cities nearby, coinage spread through the ancient world with astonishing speed. Within a few generations, dozens of Greek cities were striking their own coins, each stamped with its own badge: the owl of Athens, the tortoise of Aegina, the winged horse of Corinth. Each was at once a mark of civic pride and a guarantee of worth, an ancient logo and a promise fused into a single disc of metal. Gold had transformed completely. It was no longer just an ornament for the dead and the divine. It had become the bloodstream of trade, a way to store, move, and measure the labor of an entire civilization inside the palm of one hand. A farmer's year of work, a soldier's loyalty, a ship's worth of grain, all of it could now be captured and carried as a handful of gleaming coins. And that transformation changed, utterly, how dangerous gold had become. An ornament makes you envied, but money is different. Money is power that anyone can pick up and carry off. The moment gold became the thing that could buy armies, buy kings, buy whole empires, it became the thing that men would cross oceans to steal, and burn cities to possess, and end civilizations to hold. The next chapter is where the gleam turns to blood. In the year 1532, a Spanish soldier named Francisco Pizarro marched into the heart of the Inca Empire with fewer than 200 men. The empire he was walking toward stretched 3,000 kilometers along the spine of the Andes and governed millions of people with roads and armies and cities of stone. By any sane measure, he should not have survived the week. Within a single day, he had captured its emperor. The Inca ruler Atahualpa was seized in the highland town of Cajamarca and shut inside one small room. And there, watching his captors move and argue and stare, Atahualpa came to understand something essential about these strangers. He saw what they truly hungered for, beneath all the talk of kings and crosses. It was not land, and it was not their god. It was gold. So he made an offer that has echoed through the centuries ever since. He would fill the very room in which he was held prisoner, a chamber some 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, with gold, stacked as high as he could reach with his outstretched arm. And he would fill an adjoining space, twice over, with silver. It may be the single largest ransom ever offered by one human being for one human life. Pizarro agreed, and for 2 months, an empire emptied itself to save its king. Porters streamed in from every distant province, and they did not carry raw nuggets alone. They brought in the treasures of a civilization, sacred objects, ceremonial vessels, masterpieces of goldwork that had taken generations of artists to perfect, objects of worship and memory and unimaginable skill. And the Spanish fed nearly all of it into the fire. Priceless works of art, irreplaceable and unrepeatable, were melted down into plain, anonymous bars of gold, weighed, counted, stamped, and divided among the soldiers like ordinary loot. Centuries of artistry erased in an afternoon, so that the metal underneath could be tallied and split. What was lost in those furnaces can never be measured, because no record of it survives. Only the weight of the gold was written down. The room was filled. The ransom was delivered in full, exactly as promised. And then they killed him anyway. In July of 1533, the Spanish staged a trial, convicted Atahualpa of crimes invented under a foreign law that held no authority over him at all, and executed him. A room filled with gold had bought him nothing, because his captors had already realized the deeper truth. The treasure was not the prize. It was only the first installment of everything they intended to take. Atahualpa's fate was not one isolated tragedy. It was the signature of an entire age. That same lust for gold drove Spanish expeditions deep into unknown jungles, chasing the legend of El Dorado, a mythical city built of the metal, a place that did not exist, luring men to die of fever and starvation and madness in a search for a dream. Across 2 continents, whole civilizations were dismantled, their people driven into the mines and worked to death, their history melted into bullion so that the yellow metal could flow back across the ocean in the holds of ships. Nor was this cruelty new. More than 1,000 years earlier, the Roman Empire had torn entire mountains apart in its hunger for gold, using armies of slaves and vast engineered floods of water to collapse the hillsides and wash out the metal, leaving landscapes scarred so deeply that the wounds are still visible today. The gold that had once meant the flesh of the gods now meant something else entirely. It meant a reason to end a world. And yet, even after all of this blood, the human race did not merely keep gold. It did something stranger still. It took this metal, this cause of so much death, and chained the entire modern economy to it, on purpose. For most of history, gold's grip on humanity was informal. It was simply understood, everywhere, to be valuable. But as nations grew larger, and their economies grew more complex, they wrote that understanding into law. They tied their money directly and formally to gold and gave the arrangement a name, the gold standard. The promise at its heart was elegant, almost beautiful. Every unit of paper currency a government printed could, at least in principle, be walked into a bank and exchanged for a fixed amount of real gold, held in a vault. Your banknote was not merely a promise scribbled on paper. It was a claim ticket on actual metal. This is exactly what people meant, and still mean, when they call something as good as gold. For a long stretch, it felt like solid ground beneath the whole system. It kept governments honest, because a ruler could not simply invent new money out of nothing, not when every note had to be backed by metal that actually existed. It made trade between nations stable and predictable because everyone on Earth was measuring the value of everything against the same shining, unchanging anchor. But that anchor carried a hidden cruelty inside it. If your money was tied to gold, then the total amount of money in your entire economy was capped by the amount of metal you could dig up and lock away. Your money supply could grow no faster than your gold. And in a true crisis, that hard limit could turn from a virtue into a trap with no exit. When the Great Depression struck at the end of the 1920s, the trap slammed shut. Economies were collapsing across the world. Banks were failing by the thousands. Ordinary families were losing everything. What a wounded economy desperately needed, in that moment, was more money moving through it. Money to lend, to spend, to break the terrible downward spiral of fear and hoarding. But under the gold standard, a government simply could not create that money. It was handcuffed to the metal in its vaults, forced to stand still and watch, while its own people went hungry in the street. The very quality that had made gold so trustworthy, its scarcity, its stubborn refusal to be conjured out of thin air, had become a noose tightening around the neck of a drowning nation. And so, a government faced a brutal choice. Stay faithfully chained to the gold and let the economy strangle to death, or break the chain by whatever means it took. In one of the most powerful countries on earth, the government chose to break it. And to break it, that government did something that would sound utterly impossible today. It came for the people's gold. In the spring of 1933, the President of the United States signed a single document, Executive Order 6102, and with the stroke of a pen, it became a crime for an American to own their own gold. Read that sentence again, slowly. In the country that prized private property above nearly everything else, the government ordered its own citizens to hand over their gold coins, their gold bars, and their gold certificates to the Federal Reserve, not to sell them at a fair market price if they chose, to surrender them under threat of the law. And the penalty for refusing was not small. Anyone caught holding onto their gold could face a fine of up to $10,000, an enormous sum at the time, worth well over $150,000 in today's money, and as much as 10 years in prison, for keeping the metal that had been legal to own the day before. So the citizens complied. They lined up, and they turned in their family gold. In exchange, they were paid a fixed government price, $20.67 for every ounce. And then came the second blow, the one that turned a confiscation into something colder and more clever. Once the gold was safely gathered into government hands, the official price of gold was raised, almost overnight, to $35 an ounce. In a single stroke, the dollar was devalued by more than half. The people who had just handed over their gold at the old price could only watch as the government's new gold instantly became worth far more, while the paper dollars they had been paid with now bought noticeably less than before. They had, in effect, been robbed twice over, once of their gold, and once again of the value of the very money they had received for it. And this was no brief emergency measure that quietly vanished when the crisis passed. It became the settled law of the land, and it stayed that way for 41 years. For more than 4 decades, it was illegal for an ordinary American to freely own the metal that their own currency was supposedly built upon. The ban was not fully lifted until 1974, within the lifetimes of people still alive today. Then came the final turn of the screw. In 1971, facing a fresh wave of pressure on the dollar, the United States cut the last remaining link between its currency and gold entirely. The old promise that paper money could always be exchanged for metal, the very foundation stone of the gold standard, was severed for good. From that day onward, the dollar in your wallet has been backed by nothing at all except trust in the government that prints it. So consider what gold had just been put through. First it was seized, by force of law, from the very people who owned it. Then it was quietly abandoned by the very system that had once worshipped it as the anchor of all value, the most solid, permanent, trustworthy store of wealth that humanity had ever known was taken from the hands of the people and then cast aside by the most powerful nations on the planet. Which raises the strangest question in this entire story. If money itself walked away from gold half a century ago, if no government on earth needs it anymore to back a single dollar or pound or yen, then why, in the name of everything, do we still want the stuff so desperately? Because we never actually let go. Look at where all that gold sits today, right now. Roughly half of every ounce ever mined in all of human history has been shaped into jewelry, worn on fingers and wrists and around necks, doing the exact same job it was doing in the graves of Varna 6,000 years ago, announcing status, marking love, catching the light. Nothing about that has changed in 6 millennia. A large share of the rest sits inside the vaults of central banks, held by the very governments that cut their own currencies loose from gold in the first place. They abandoned the gold standard, and then they quietly kept the gold anyway. Tens of thousands of tons of it, stacked in guarded rooms, held in reserve as a silent insurance policy against the day the world stops trusting paper money. And even now, in the present moment, central banks are buying more of it, not less, quietly stacking away the metal they officially no longer need. And then there is the part that almost no one ever stops to think about. Gold in your pocket, this very second. Gold happens to be one of the finest conductors of electricity that will never corrode, never tarnish, never fail. That makes it perfect for the tiny, delicate connections inside modern electronics, where a single corroded contact could kill the whole device. So there is gold in your smartphone, gold in your laptop, gold in the satellites passing silently overhead, in the visors of astronauts, in the circuit boards of very nearly every device you own and depend on. The concentration is so high that a genuinely strange inversion has taken place. A full ton of ordinary gold ore, blasted and crushed out of a mountain, might yield only around 5 grams of gold. But a ton of discarded smartphones can yield several hundred grams from the same weight. Ounce for ounce, the forgotten junk drawer has become richer than the mine. Recyclers have a name for this now. They call it urban mining. And they pull gold not from mountains anymore, but from the growing mountain of electronics that the modern world throws away every single year. So the metal born in the collision of dead stars, buried in the crust of a young planet, dug out by ancient hands, made into the money of kings, fought over by empires, seized by governments, and abandoned by the modern economy, has completed an almost unbelievable journey. It began as the ornament of the gods. It became the bloodstream of trade. It was the cause of conquest and the prisoner of law. And it has ended up here, in the glass and metal rectangle in your hand, so utterly common that you carry it everywhere you go and never once think of it as treasure. So return, one last time, to the question, why? Why has an entire species been willing to kill, enslave, and criminalize one another over a soft metal that does almost nothing at all? The answer, in the end, is not about anything gold can do. It is about the things gold cannot do. Gold cannot rust, so it outlasts every empire foolish enough to think it owned it. Gold cannot be faked, so it can never lie about what it truly is. Gold cannot be printed, so no ruler, however desperate, can conjure more of it to paper over a debt or pay for a war. And gold cannot be manufactured here on Earth, not by any furnace or factory or act of human will, because the only forge that ever made it was the death of a star in a cataclysm that will not be repeated anywhere near this planet, ever again. In a world where nearly everything can now be copied, counterfeited, or created out of thin air, in an age where money itself is just glowing numbers that appear and vanish on a screen, gold remains the single thing that cannot be conjured into existence. It is rare in a way that nothing human can ever undo. And perhaps that, in the end, is the real reason the wanting has never once stopped. Not because gold is useful, because in an age of endless copies, human beings still ache for the one thing that is genuinely, permanently, cosmically rare. You are carrying a fragment of a dead star in your pocket. It survived the birth of the solar system. It survived the rise and fall of every civilization that ever chased it across the earth. It survived being seized and hoarded and finally cast aside by the very system that once crowned it king. And it will still be here, shining exactly as it does now, unchanged and incorruptible, long after everyone alive today is gone. So here is something to carry with you, and to leave in the comments below. If the entire power of gold comes from the single fact that it cannot be made, then what happens on the day, perhaps centuries from now, when someone finally learns to manufacture it? Would gold still be precious? Or would the human hunger simply move on to the next impossible thing? Say what you think down below. And if the buried history of the ordinary objects all around you is the kind of thing that keeps you turning something over in your mind, stay a while. There is a great deal more hidden just beneath the surface of everyday life, and there is always another everyday thing with a secret worth digging up.